Can somebody please confirm you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Come on. All right, my computer is going to be a little slow because it's still processing the lecture. I have to process the file before I can put it up on YouTube, and it's still doing that. Um, Before we begin, are there any questions? All right, let me share my screen. Let me talk a little bit about the syllabus. I don't think I need to talk about the class at all. Let me do mention that in the website. By the way, when I clicked on Zoom meeting, for some reason it opened Adobe Creative Cloud. I think I'll shut that down. Is there anyone who wants to use Adobe Creative Cloud? Or is it okay if I remove that link? I should look and see if that link's any good to either. I'm not sure I have anything under that. Let me remind you in the class that the lab follows the lecture. So here's lecture for week one, and there's the lab for week one. Oh, good. The lecture page just finished, so my computer will be speeding up. For this week, we're going to be looking at lab module 00 on lab safety. We'll do that today. And on Thursday, we'll look at lab module 01, ubiquity of organisms, which you can see in the, what the heck is this? Schedule of classes. Right there. So lab safety training will be today, and then ubiquity of microorganisms will be on Thursday. You should also realize that the online plagiarism quiz is due 11:59 p.m. this Saturday, and you must achieve 100% on the plagiarism quiz, but you may take the quiz for a total of something like 7 times. Any question about any of that? All right, I do need to talk a little bit about the syllabus. I'm not going to talk about what I talked about in the lecture, but there were a few parts of the lab where I said we'll talk about it in the lab. You can get it. Uh, the points will just be added together for a total of 720 points, but some of them are in the lab. Some that come from the lab are obviously the lab assignments. Uh, there's 10 lab worksheets. They're worth about 5 points each. You'll notice the very first two are actually worth 2.5. So there's probably 11 worksheets. Uh, there's the identification of the unknown project that's worth 75 points. The infectious disease project, that's a lab project for 100 points. In the final, we'll have some questions from the lab. Excuse me here. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. We'll talk about the virtual lab when we talk about the microscope. That'll happen in a lab later, not today. The safety information for students and physicians. It is included only for educational purposes as future nurses, dental hygienists, or other people working in the allied health field. It's important that you're aware of these issues. However, in this online class, you will not become infected with a microorganism. because everything we do will be online. But the microbiology labs at Clark College are operated on a biosafety level 2, meaning personal protective equipment like lab coats, gloves, goggles are required to be used in the lab. Access to the lab is restricted by the laboratory director. If you're either immunocompromised, living with or caring for somebody who's immunocompromised, you're going to be pregnant or become pregnant, you take special precautions. You can read about that because on the online class, we don't need to really know about it. The species on the list will be grown every term. There are BSL1 organisms and BSL2. BSL stands for Biosafety Level 1. These organisms are the lowest risk. You can get infected by these, and they can even, in fact, kill you, but they're not likely to cause a major infection or kill you. Like E. coli, everybody has it in their gut, but that doesn't mean you can't get an infection. If E. coli is growing elsewhere other than in the gut, it will cause an infection. Anyways, these are biosafety level 1 organisms. They are considered low risk. And then there's biosafety level 2 organisms that are considered medium risk, like Staphylococcus aureus actually causes human skin infections as well as other infections, but um, Streptococcus pyogenes causing strep throat. These are the organisms we'll be largely working with in the lab. Here's the lab safety rules. Laboratory safety will be described in detail during the first week of class, although we will not physically meet in campus this term in microbiology, because we have an online class. You must learn about the lab safety protocols. It's a required component of this course. Many nursing programs also report that safety is one of the main skills they want their students to learn. Safety is of primary importance in this lab. The attitudes and actions of persons working in the lab determine the level of safety. Never take shortcuts which risk the safety and accuracy of the lab. Follow these rules. You're not allowed to take any personal items to your lab bench. They must remain in your book bag, a space provided for bags, or outside the lab. All required equipment, paper, pens, etc., will be provided for you, and anything that is provided for you must not be taken out of the lab. Only enrolled microbiology students are permitted in the lab unless authorized by the instructor. All personal items, book bags, books, purses, cell phones, lab person's coats must be stored in a cubbyhole, a little cabinet, which we consider outside of the lab. When we talk about the microbiology lab, you actually walk inside the door, and that is not in the lab yet. And then you walk, put your bags in the cubbyhole or the cabinet. That's also not in the lab. And then you walk over to the sink, wash your hands, and then as soon as you walk away from the sink, that's where we call the lab proper. From then on, nothing must come into the lab or leave the lab. Any question about any of that? So the place where you put your bags and the door is considered outside of the lab, at least the lab proper. So put your personal items in the cubbyhole, and anything that goes into the lab must remain in the lab and cannot come out of the lab until it is effectively sterilized either by putting it in bleach or some other disinfectant for 15 minutes, or it is autoclaved. If you were to take your phone into the lab proper, it would be confiscated and then would not be returned to you until it would be either disinfected in something like bleach or autoclaved, either of which would destroy the phone. Obviously, paper could be treated with either, especially if you're writing in pencil, and may be taken out of the lab after it is disinfected. So anything taken into the lab that shouldn't be in the lab will be confiscated and only returned after it is disinfected. Exceptions. You are allowed to take some personal items into the lab if you are wearing them, such as jewelry, a watch, your eyeglasses, somebody who has hearing aids. You should not touch these items while you are in the lab, because if you do, you could transfer microorganisms to them, like to your glasses. And then when you take them out of the lab, the microorganisms may leave the lab. All cultures you're working with are considered to be potentially pathogenic. Keep hands, pencils, and other materials out of your mouth, your ears, your nose, etc. No eating or drinking, smoking, gum chewing, or any other oral habit is allowed in the lab. You always wear gloves when you're in the lab, and they're provided by the lab. You should also monitor yourself for possible symptoms of a bacterial infection like diarrhea, fever, abdominal cramps. I've never had a student get that. Unfortunately, none of the students have ever taken the microbes home with them, at least my students. I'll let you read about that. While you're in the lab, you must wear closed-toed shoes, meaning the toes must be closed, even by a tennis shoe. You cannot have a lady's fancy open-toed shoe. You cannot wear thongs or sandals in the lab. Lab coats are also required. They must be worn completely buttoned up. Obviously, I mentioned you put on gloves. And then whenever you're working with a splash hazard, that would be a liquid culture containing microbes or something that could be a splash hazard to get into your eye, like you're working with disinfectant or something, you should wear goggles. So goggles are required anytime you're working with a liquid culture or a splash hazard. Like if you're staining, um, using the gram stain, the crystal violet would be hazardous to your eye, so you must wear goggles. The decolorizing agent would be um, hazardous to your eye as also. Decolorizing agent for the gram stain. We'll talk about that when we talk about the gram stain. Cleanliness is a virtue in microbiology. You must disinfect your lab bench both before you begin work and after you are done working and before you leave the lab. So you always wash your hands when you come into the lab. So you put your stuff in the cubby hole, uh, go to the sink, wash your hands. You should do that well, washing for at least 20 seconds, scrubbing everywhere, rinsing it off, drying your hands. Then go put on your lab coat, put on your gloves. If you're working with a splash hazard, you then put on goggles. Most of the time, we do not work with a splash hazard in the lab. So goggles are not most of the time used, but sometimes they are. And then go to your desk where you work, and you would first want to disinfect it, spray it down with disinfectant, wipe it around with a paper towel, and then take the paper towel and throw it in the trash can. And then do your work with the microbes. And then before you go, wipe down the area you work with the disinfectant. Go take off your gloves, take off your lab coat, go wash your hands, go to the cubbyhole and pick up your stuff, the cabinets, and then you can leave. Any question about any of that procedure? All right, accidents should be reported to the instructor. Minor accidents should be cleaned as followed. Always clean broken glass first. Broken glass can cut skin and it can go right through gloves. Always use a brush and a broom and a dustpan. Never pick up broken glass with your fingers, even if you're wearing gloves. Spilled strong acids and bases should be diluted and wiped up quickly. We don't usually work with acids and bases in microbiology. Spilled bacterial culture should be cleaned as followed. Cover the spilled material with lots of paper towels. Drench the paper towels with lots of disinfectant. Let the disinfectant sit for 15 minutes. Then wipe it up with paper towels. Remove the broken glass separately. Put that in the broken glass container. And then all of the other stuff should be discarded in the biohazard trash can. The biohazard trash should never have glass in it. Any questions about any of that? All right. Be sure you keep your hair, if it's long, and paper away from Bunsen burners and back to incinerators. Hair, if it's long, should be tied back. If you don't have a tie, we have them in the microbiology lab. Samples may only be brought into the lab when you get authorization from the instructor. Samples should never be taken out of the lab. You should not mouth pipette while in the lab. The Bunsen burner and Bechtel incinerator should be turned off when they're not being used or will not be used within 5 minutes. If you have a cut or sore in your hand, you have to go through a special procedure. You wash your hands first, then you go to the first aid kit, get a Band-Aid, cover the wound with a Band-Aid, and then put the glove on over the Band-Aid. And then when you leave, you do need to wash your hands. You may, after you wash your hands, go put on a fresh Band-Aid. I'll let you read about that. It's not terribly important for the online class. So remember, the area where your bags are stored and the door is considered outside the lab. And to enter the lab, you need to take, I don't know, a step or two into the lab from that area before we consider that in the lab. Any question about that? So those are the procedures we use for the microbiology lab. We won't be doing that because our lab will be online. However, you do need to know these procedures and you will be quizzed on them. This isn't terribly important, but safety is important in microbiology. All right, any questions about any of that? So we're going to do lab module 00, lab safety training, which you can view right here. Hopefully I've got it working right. There we go, laboratory, lab module 00. When you're doing the lab modules, they sometimes have questions in them. However, I have not updated the lab module questions, and I do not want the lab modules turned in. I want the worksheet only turned in. The reason being is the lab module is much bigger than the worksheet. And if every student were to turn in all of the lab modules, my Canvas website would soon fill up, and then you students would no longer be able to turn in an assignment. So please do not turn in the lab modules, only turn in the lab worksheets. And I've got that stated someplace. And if you do it the first time, I'll give you a warning. The second time, you're going to get a penalty. So only turn in the lab worksheets. Any question about any of that? If not, let me go to the lab worksheet and get it here. It'll be better to view. I don't think I've highlighted this. Let me see if there's one I've highlighted. I'll have to go through it. All right. Lab Module 0, Lab Safety for Microbiology. The learning objectives are 1, distinguish between safe and unsafe laboratory practices. 2, understand where relevant safety equipment is located in the lab. And you don't really need to know where it's located. You just need to know what the laboratory safety equipment is. Understand how to safely dispose of contaminated materials. All right. Is this getting too dark for you? Do you want me to turn on the light in here? I'm not hearing anything, so I'll just move on. All right, safety is of primary importance in the lab. The attitudes and actions of the persons working in the lab determine the level of safety. If you take a positive and respectful attitude towards microorganisms, never take shortcuts and risk safety and accuracy, you will not contaminate your surroundings, you will not contaminate yourself, and you will not contaminate other people in the lab. So please follow the procedures as they are given to you. All right, I've already mentioned you're not allowed to take any personal items to the lab bench. If you do, it'll be confiscated and will not be returned to you until it has been sterilized, either treated with disinfectant or autoclaved. You may bring things to the cubbyhole or the cabinet and put them with your bag in there. And remember that region is considered outside the lab. Everything should be provided for you, paper, pens, pencils, writing instruments. Nothing should be taken out of the lab unless it's been sterilized. You are required to follow these rules, and normally you'd sign a form agreeing to this fact. We won't do that for the online class, but we will be tested over these rules. Failure to do so may jeopardize the safety and safety of your safety and safety of others, as well as contaminate the lab. I won't tell you about the penalty because this is an online class. All right. This picture is actually showing you what you should look like if you come into the microbiology lab. And I'll warn you that some of the questions refer really to this question because it's not refer to this picture because it doesn't state it anywhere in the lab text, but it is in the picture. And that is, you must wear closed-toed shoes. You must wear your lab coat completely buttoned up. You must wear gloves. If there's a splash hazard, you must wear goggles, which I don't think those are goggles. I think this person actually wears glasses. And then that reminds me to tell you that you are allowed to bring certain things into the lab that you are wearing, such as glasses, a watch. Of course, the watch will be underneath your glove, and jewelry. I don't know if she's wearing any jewelry or not, but you can take jewelry that you're wearing into the lab. Almost every other personal item should not be brought into the lab, and any personal item that you're wearing should not be touched while you're in the lab, so the microorganisms do not get on them. We do provide lab coats for you if you did not purchase one in the bookstore. Most students use those provided in the lab. Every term, a few students bring in their own lab coats. The lab coat will be stored in the lab, and then you will reuse it throughout the term. If you bring in your own lab coat, it will be stored in the lab until actually after the end of the term. And then if you want it back, you just turn it into your instructor, and we will turn it into the lab prep people, the lab technicians, and they will autoclave the lab coat and then wash it and then hang it up and then put it in a place for you guys to pick it up after the end of the term. And so it is never brought into the lab except for very first day. And it does not ever leave the lab until after the term is ended. And that's true of almost everything, although most things aren't brought into the lab. So always wash your hands before and after working in the lab, meaning before you start, right when you come in, you should wash your hands at the start, and then right before you leave, you should wash your hands. Nitrile gloves are required to be worn and they're provided for you. Paper and writing instruments are provided for you. And we have a desk space, which I'm not going to talk about because you're not ever going to go into the lab, but we actually have a desk space where you have a cabinet to store your items in the lab. Cell phone use is not allowed in the lab. If ever you get a call and you hear it ringing in your bag, you may, if you wish, um, take off your gloves, take off your lab coat, wash your hands, go answer your phone, assuming it's still ringing, go outside the lab, answer the phone, do your business on the phone, come back inside the room, not inside the lab, come inside the door, put away the phone in the cubbyhole, go back to the sink, wash your hands, walk into the lab proper, put on your lab coat, put on your gloves. And that's how you would use the phone, meaning you cannot use the phone inside the lab. Obviously, keep everything away from your mouth, your ears, your nose. Don't do any of this. This is actually spraying disinfectant on the workbench. This is actually what the workbench looks like in our microbiology lab. Wipe it down, and then you allow the wiper, the disinfectant, you don't totally wipe it dry, you just spread it around, and then you let it air dry, and we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, here is some safety equipment, which is in every lab. There's a fire alarm, which you only pull in case there's a fire. A first aid kit, that's that little white thing up there. That is actually a fire blanket. If someone's ever on fire, they can't run to the shower, cover them with a fire blanket. We also have a fire extinguisher, which is pointing to it. I don't see it now. Oh, there it is here. And then an eye wash station. If you ever get something in your eyes, come to the eye wash station to wash it out. And a deluge shower. Like if you were to spray yourself with chemicals and you want to wash it off, come to the shower. Fortunately, I've never had a student use this for one reason. The shower drains on the floor. It's true we have a drain on the floor, but the whole floor in this area will become wet. I have had not one student, but a visiting scientist, which actually had happened long before I ever was teaching microbiology, use the eye wash station. And that's the only time I've ever had the eye wash station used. He got a chemical in his eye, and I told him, wash it out, the eye wash station. All right, any questions about the lab safety equipment? You don't know where it needs in the lab, but you do need to know what it is. And I think it's pretty obvious why you'd use these. I've already mentioned that students who are immunocompromised or living or caring with immunocompromised individuals are pregnant or may become pregnant should inform your instructor. And if you are in the live microbiology lab, meaning an in-class lab, we would give you a microbe of very low risk, um, so that if you were to get it on your skin, you would not take it to someone who could potentially become infected. But generally, we've given immunocompromised students something that we consider very safe. All right, I've already talked about accidents. Remember, laboratory safety goggles are not always used in the microbiology lab. They're only used when there is a splash hazard. A splash hazard would be something that could splash into the eye and damage the eye, or a liquid culture containing bacteria. And that's what we mean by liquid culture, a liquid containing bacteria. This is a Bacto incinerator. I'll point it out to you. And what we do is we put our tools like a loop inside the Bacto incinerator or inside the flame until it becomes red hot, like right there, it's becoming red hot. There, maybe at the very farthest end, but we let this entire wire become red hot. And that's to sterilize the wire. Don't leave these on if they're not being used. Will not be used for 5 minutes. They should be turned off. If you do turn off the Bacto incinerator, remember it'll take up to 5 minutes to come to temperature to sterilize things. So it's usually best to turn this on 5 minutes before you know you're going to need it. Keep lids on all chemicals and reagent bottles when they're not in use. Do not pour chemicals down the drain or in the trash unless you have instructor permission. We usually, with stains and gosh, is there any other thing we have that's harmful? Not really, but with stains, we usually store that. You don't dump it down the sink, and then we dispose of it as a biohazard liquid waste, which I think we call somebody in and they have a disposal company, and I don't know what they do with it, but they dispose of it properly. Old specimens must be discarded in the following proper ways. Agar plates that have bacteria in them are put in the biohazard waste bin. That's because the agar plates are always plastic. We never use glass. Glass would never be put in the biohazard bin. Glass slides, you put it in the glass slide container. It has disinfectant in it. Cotton swabs, put it in the cotton swab container. It also has disinfectant in it. Pipettes, put it in the glass pipette container, which may or may not have disinfectant in it. It will be sterilized before it is washed, and usually the glass pipettes are autoclaved. And then will be washed, and then, if needed, sterilized and reused. The slides are also reused. We will put it in disinfectant to sterilize them or disinfect them, I guess. Not sterilize, but disinfect them. And then they'll be washed, dried, and then reused. The cover slips we do not reuse. They will be put in disinfectant and then discarded in broken glass container. Glass test tubes, please remove the label. Usually you write on tape on them and place it in the test tube rack found in the back of the lab. You don't need to know where it's found because we're not going to be in the lab, but you put it in the test tube holder, and then they will be autoclaved, washed, and then reused. And we don't have any other glass containers, but if we did, that's where it would go and that's how it'd be treated. The glass pipettes would be something similar. Um, for something that is not contaminated, like paper towels and gloves that you've not gotten bacteria on, those can be placed in the regular trash can. All materials contaminated with bacteria or microbes should be put in the biohazard container. If they have glass in it, then it should not be put in the biohazard container. Glass never goes in the biohazard container. If it's broken glass, you should disinfect it with disinfectant for 15 minutes, pull out the broken glass, and put it in the broken glass container. And then the other material should be in the biohazard material, like the paper towels you wipe up the spill with. Whenever in doubt, always ask. All right. So to do the questions, don't do the questions in the lab module. They've not been updated. Do the questions in the worksheet. And I've changed the worksheet a little bit. Come on. Come on. For some reason not showing. Laboratory worksheet for to lab module 00. Remember, the worksheet must be turned in by 8 a.m. Friday of week 1, or you will be dropped from the class. Meaning I'm going to take attendance from turning in the worksheet. It looks like I've even cut out the first thing here. And then I have the questions here. Only turn in the worksheet, otherwise you'll get a warning, and then after that, a penalty. Rule 1, in the lab, what do you always wear for safety before you enter the lab? This is not directly stated in the lab, but you can see it from the picture that was shown. And after you enter the lab, what 2 items do you put on after you enter the lab? And obviously, this is after you enter the lab. In rule 2, rule 1 is what you put on for safety before you enter the lab. So they should be different. Any questions about rule 1 or rule 2? All right.
Oh, I actually have one, sorry. I do you know where to find the answer to what to put on after you enter the lab? Because I've got rule number one. I found that, but this rule number two isn't as clear to me when I look at the
Rule
module.
number 1 is not stated in the lab module, but you can get it from the picture. Rule number 2 should be stated in the lab module. So I
Okay,
did state it as I even was talking about the lab, and you can find it in the lab module.
okay, thank you.
Okay. So you just have to ask when you come into the lab, what do you put on to keep yourself safe? All right. Rule 1, like I said, you can find it in the picture. It's not directly stated in the lab module. But this would be something you put on while you're at home, probably. All right. Rule 3, look up what a safety data sheet is. You got to do that online. Each chemical in the lab has a safety data sheet, or SDS, that describes what? And provide at least a phrase for each answer, meaning a one-word answer is not acceptable. And by the way, I've got an asterisk to tell you how many answers you should give for each question. So rule 1, you should give 1, 2, 3, 4 different items. Rule 2, 2 different items. Rule 3, I believe 5 different items. And don't bother erasing the asterisks because I will remember. And if you just erase the asterisk, so you'll only get yourself confused. So this is how many answers each question should have an answer to. All right. And then rule 4, know the location of your safety equipment. Name 5 items of safety equipment found in the microbiology lab. That is discussed in the lab module. You also have a picture of it in the lab module. And then rule 5, name 2 items that you can take into the lab. 1, 2. And then 3, can you eat and drink in the lab? And that's a yes or no answer. Okay, any question about that? All right. Question 2, list one item of laboratory attire that you must wear in a microbiology lab. And then question 3, list one item belonging to you that is allowed to be brought into a microbiology lab. Don't say something like a lab coat because it's already in the lab. Don't say something like goggles because they're in the lab. Don't say something like gloves. This is something belonging to you that you can bring in the microbiology lab. And then 4, list one item belonging to you that is not allowed in the microbiology lab. And you can put a lot of things in rule number 4, or question number 4, sorry. All right, remember to submit this by 8 a.m. Friday of week 1 in the folder for worksheet lab 00, or you will be dropped from the class. Remember, I will use this for attendance for week 1. I must turn in who is attending the lab, and I'll do this from who turns in worksheet lab 00 and worksheet lab 01. Both must be turned in. All right, any questions? If not, I will be here until about 8:30 to answer any questions, or until the last student logs out, in which case I will log out. So I'm only here for as long as somebody is here. So if you have a question, make sure you log in early in the lab. Any questions? Let me remind you, only turn in the lab worksheet. Do not turn in the lab module. All right, let me see. I'll stop the share. Stop the recording. There we go.